Right now, on March 30th, 2025, something is happening that most analysts are genuinely afraid to say out loud to their audience. America is not just fighting Iran, America is walking into a trap designed 2 decades ago and already closing around Washington's decisions today. Today, I want to walk you through exactly how this trap works, step by step, in plain and simple English for everyone watching. Not the version you get from cable news, the real version. The one that explains why powerful nations make decisions that look completely irrational from the outside. Not the version you get from cable news, the real version. The one that explains why powerful nations make decisions that look completely irrational from outside. Decisions that make total sense the moment you understand the system underneath. So let us start with the single most important fact almost nobody is discussing.
20 years of studying, modeling, wargaming, and building a military architecture specifically designed to neutralize what America does best on a battlefield. While America was fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, while planners were focused on counterinsurgency and nation building, Iran was doing something entirely different. Iran was watching every American military operation, analyzing every tactic, identifying every structural weakness in the way America projects its power abroad, and Iran was building a military doctrine around one core insight that most Western analysts still refuse to fully accept even today in 2025. You do not beat America by fighting America the way America wants to fight. You beat America by making the cost of staying unacceptable to the public and to the politicians. And Iran was building its entire military doctrine around one core insight that most Western analysts still refuse to fully accept. In my view, this is the absolute heart of the trap. Iran does not need a military victory over the United States to achieve its core objectives in this confrontation. Iran only needs to create a situation where every military move America makes generates more strategic problems than it solves on the ground and in the headlines. And the architecture to produce exactly that outcome is already fully in place and already operating right now as we speak. When most people hear the phrase asymmetric warfare, they picture small fighters using improvised weapons against a larger conventional army in open terrain. But Iran's version of this strategy operates on an entirely different level, at the level of systems, of cascading consequences, of traps that take years to build and seconds to spring. Iran has dispersed its missile systems across the country into hardened underground facilities, specifically built to survive a first strike and still launch a sustained response. Iran has built and maintained proxy networks across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen that can activate simultaneously, stretching American response capacity across multiple fronts. And Iran has positioned forces around the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves without interruption. That strait is a lever. If it gets pulled, shockwaves reach every major economy on Earth within days, not weeks, days. That is the scale of what sits in the background. Here is what all of this means practically for American planners, and this is the part that should make every serious observer uncomfortable. America can absolutely inflict enormous damage on Iranian military infrastructure. The strikes already visible in this conflict make that point clearly and undeniably. American air power is real. American precision capability is formidable. Nobody serious is questioning that. But here's the distinction that actually changes everything. Inflicting military damage and achieving lasting political objectives are two completely different things, and that gap is exactly where Iran has built its entire strategic architecture. Iran does not need its military to be invincible. Iran just needs the political cost of this war to keep rising faster than the visible benefit of staying in it. What this suggests is that America has entered a situation where the most militarily appealing option is also the one most likely to produce the worst long-term strategic outcome. That is the most sophisticated kind of trap, not one that is hidden from view, but one that is fully visible and still nearly impossible to exit cleanly once you are inside it. Because here is what makes this moment genuinely different from every previous confrontation between America and Iran across the past 40 years of tension. The domestic political situation in America, the state of military resources after 2 decades of continuous operations, and the position of regional allies have all converged at once. They have converged in a way that eliminates the off-ramps that existed in earlier crises. The room to maneuver is smaller now, the stakes are higher, and the trap is better built. They have converged in a way that eliminates off-ramps that existed in earlier crises. The room to maneuver is smaller, the stakes are higher, the trap is better built, and drop a comment below telling me what you think America's single biggest strategic mistake has been so far. What comes next is the mechanism behind the trap. Here is something that almost never gets mentioned in mainstream coverage. The American military does not want this war, not because of any lack of capability or courage, but because the planners who simulate these conflicts have seen the results, and those results are not what television is showing you. Multiple analysts and former defense officials who have studied American war game exercises against Iran have said publicly that simulations consistently produce outcomes Washington refuses to discuss openly. Not a quick, decisive victory, not a clean campaign with a defined endpoint. Something that looks far more like a slow multi-front escalation with no visible exit strategy. The reason comes down to one fundamental mismatch in American military strategy, a mismatch that has built up over 30 years and is now a serious liability in this specific conflict. America's military was designed for a specific kind of war, one where air superiority is established fast, precision strikes dismantle command structures within days, and the enemy collapses within weeks. That model worked in the Gulf War in 1991. It appeared to work in the opening weeks of Iraq in 2003. It is the playbook America has refined and invested in heavily for 3 full decades. Iran has spent those same 3 decades studying that playbook in detail, identifying every assumption it rests on, and building a military structure specifically designed to make those assumptions fail on contact. This is not speculation. Iranian military doctrine, analyzed at institutions including the RAND Corporation, is explicitly built around denying America its preferred style of warfare in any direct confrontation. Iran does not mass its forces in ways that invite American airstrikes. It disperses. It places critical systems underground. It uses redundancy to survive a first strike and still retain the ability to respond. And critically, Iran has invested in the ability to retaliate across multiple domains simultaneously: missiles, drones, naval assets in the Persian Gulf, and proxy forces across several neighboring countries. In my view, this is what makes the situation genuinely dangerous beyond the immediate exchanges we are watching. The danger is not that Iran wins a conventional military battle against America. The danger is that Iran does not need to win a conventional battle. Iran only needs to make the cost of continuing high enough for long enough to shift the political calculus inside Washington. History suggests that strategy can work. It worked in Vietnam. It worked in Lebanon in 1983 when a single attack drove American forces out entirely. It partially worked in Iraq as well. Iran's leadership has studied every one of those cases. They understand, perhaps better than many Western commentators, how domestic political pressure inside a democracy becomes a strategic weapon over time. So let us talk about the geography, because it matters enormously and rarely gets explained clearly to a general audience following the news coverage of this conflict. Iran controls a long stretch of coastline along the Strait of Hormuz. That strait is roughly 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest navigable point. 33 kilometers. Every day, approximately 17 to 20 million barrels of oil pass through it. That is somewhere between 17 and 20% of total global daily oil consumption moving through a single narrow choke point. Iran has spent years positioning anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, and mine-laying capability around that strait, not necessarily to close it, but to threaten it credibly enough to move oil prices. Iran has spent years positioning anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, and mine-laying capability around that strait, not to close it permanently, but to threaten it enough to move oil prices. To neutralize that threat fully, America would need to conduct sustained operations along the Iranian coastline itself. That means operating in shallow, confined waters where large surface ships are more exposed. American aircraft carriers draw around 12 meters of water and are difficult to maneuver in confined coastal environments. They are built for open ocean operations, not for contested narrow straits. This is one reason carrier groups have been positioned at significant distance from the Iranian coast. Strategically logical, but it limits the close air support any coastal campaign would need. What this suggests is that America faces a genuine geographic and tactical dilemma that does not have a clean military solution available to it in this specific theater of operations. You can degrade Iranian infrastructure from range. That capability has already been demonstrated clearly, but degrading infrastructure is not the same as removing the underlying threat to that 33-kilometer choke point. Serious. As long as Iran retains dispersed missile systems and the ability to credibly threaten the Strait, it holds leverage over global energy markets that is disproportionate to its overall military strength. As long as Iran retains dispersed missiles and can credibly threaten the Strait, it holds leverage over global energy markets that is disproportionate to its overall conventional military strength. Thoughtful. The trap is not just military, it is geographic, economic, and political, all at the same time, all reinforcing each other. Here is the part of this story that nobody in Washington wants to say publicly, but every serious strategist understands privately. Size. The longer this conflict continues, the more it starts to resemble something America has lived through before, and the historical parallel is not flattering at all. In 1965, the United States sent approximately 3,500 Marines into Da Nang, Vietnam. It was described as a limited mission with a clear and defined objective. 4 years later, America had over 500,000 troops on the ground, from 3,500 to 500,000. That is not an escalation. That is a plan that collapsed into something nobody originally intended. The mechanism that drove that escalation has a name that every military strategist knows. It is called mission creep, and it is one of the most powerful forces in the history of armed conflict. Mission creep works like this. You commit forces to achieve Objective A. Objective A requires controlling Area B to be sustainable. Controlling B exposes you to Threat C. Neutralizing C pulls you into Territory D. At every step, going further feels more rational than stopping. Because stopping means admitting that everything already spent, in lives, in money, in political capital, was spent for nothing. Psychologists call this the sunk cost effect. The more you have invested, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when walking away is clearly the more rational choice available. This dynamic does not require bad leadership to activate. It activates almost automatically once a military commitment reaches a certain threshold of public visibility and cost. Any sustained operation in Iran would begin with a specific, limited, defensible objective. Taking a strategic asset, securing a coastline, establishing a buffer zone. The initial framing would sound precise and bounded, but Iran's geography makes that framing almost impossible to maintain once forces are committed on the ground in any significant numbers. Iran covers roughly 1.6 million square kilometers. Its terrain includes mountain ranges, desert plateaus, and a long coastline, all defensible by a force that prepared for decades. The Zagros Mountains along Iran's western edge rise to over 4,000 meters in places. Any force operating there faces a constant tactical problem that cannot be resolved from the air alone. Military analysts have pointed to Iranian geography as a fundamental constraint on any ground campaign for years. The terrain does not favor a rapid advance. It strongly favors a defender who knows it well. Iran has approximately 580,000 active military personnel, supplemented by the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij paramilitary organization. These are not forces that collapse under initial military pressure. What this suggests is that any ground component, however limited its stated objectives at the start, faces structural pressures toward expansion that are very hard to resist once underway. The real danger, in my view, is not that American planners fail to understand this. The danger is that political pressure for visible results can override strategic judgment once casualties begin. That is exactly what happened in Vietnam. Military leadership understood relatively early that the strategy was not working, but admitting that publicly cost more than continuing short term. And the short term kept extending, month after month, year after year, until the gap between the public narrative and the operational reality became impossible to sustain any longer. A committed force, complex terrain, a motivated defender with decades of preparation, and domestic political pressure for visible results. All four conditions are active right now simultaneously. A committed force, complex terrain, a motivated defender with decades of preparation, and domestic political pressure for visible results. All four conditions are active simultaneously. Recognizing those conditions clearly is not pessimism. It is the kind of analysis that gives decision makers the best chance of avoiding the trap before it closes completely around them, because the trap does not close all at once. It closes gradually, one incremental decision at a time, each one appearing reasonable in isolation, each one making the next step slightly more likely than the last. That is how America reached 500,000 troops in Vietnam, not through one decision, through 1,000 small ones, each of which felt like the minimum necessary response to the situation directly at hand. So here is the question this entire video has been building toward. If the military option escalates, diplomacy is blocked, and withdrawal triggers a chain reaction, what does America actually do? The honest answer, when you strip away press briefings and political statements, is that every available path carries a serious cost, and that is not a failure of one administration. That is the result of decades of strategic decisions that each made sense individually, but created a cumulative trap with no clean exit available now. America's position in the Middle East was built on three interlocking pillars that reinforced each other for roughly 50 years and are now all under pressure at the same time. The first pillar was military dominance, forward presence, carrier groups, bases across the Gulf, a security umbrella that the entire regional order was constructed around for generations. The second pillar was the petrodollar arrangement. Gulf nations priced oil in US dollars, which created permanent global demand for dollars and recycled capital flows back into American financial markets. The third pillar was political relationships, the partnerships with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and others that provided diplomatic leverage and intelligence access across the entire region. These three pillars worked together as a system. Military presence enabled the political relationships. Political relationships sustained the petrodollar. The petrodollar funded the military presence. What this conflict is doing, beyond the immediate military dimension, is putting visible stress on all three pillars simultaneously for the first time in decades. That matters enormously. Every day this continues without a clear strategic outcome, the military pillar's credibility erodes slightly. Not catastrophically, but visibly. And in geopolitics, perception matters almost as much as reality. Gulf states are watching carefully. Saudi Arabia has been deepening economic ties with China. The UAE has been diversifying its strategic partnerships. These are not coincidences. They are deliberate hedges. And the petrodollar, while still functioning, has faced more public discussion of alternatives in the past 3 years than in the previous 3 decades. That conversation does not stop when a conflict ends. In my view, this is the deeper trap the immediate military situation sits inside. The question is not only whether America can manage this conflict, it is what this conflict does to the broader architecture underneath. History tells us that when a dominant power gets drawn into a prolonged, costly conflict, the secondary effects often matter more long-term than the military outcome itself. Britain learned this after the Suez Crisis in 1956. That operation was not a catastrophic defeat, yet it marked the clear end of British global power, exposing limits of reach that could not be unseen. That analogy is not perfect. America's position is far stronger than Britain's was in 1956. But the underlying dynamic carries a lesson worth taking seriously by anyone watching this situation develop. So, what does a realistic path forward look like from here? There are two broad scenarios worth thinking through honestly. The first is a managed de escalation. Back channel diplomacy, possibly through intermediaries like Oman or Qatar, produces a face saving pause that neither side has to publicly describe as a defeat. This is possible. It has happened before in US Iran tensions, but it requires both sides to have more to gain from stopping than continuing. And right now, domestic pressures on both sides push in the opposite direction. The second scenario is a prolonged asymmetric engagement. No dramatic escalation, no clean resolution. A sustained, low intensity conflict that keeps energy markets volatile and accumulates strategic costs. What this suggests is that the most consequential decisions in this conflict may not be the military ones being made right now. They may be the diplomatic and economic ones that have not yet been seriously attempted. What this suggests is that the most consequential decisions may not be the military ones being made right now. They may be the diplomatic and economic ones not yet seriously attempted by either side. The trap was not built in a day and will not be escaped in a day. The question is whether decision makers understand the full shape of what they are inside before the next step makes the next inevitable.